Hello everyone, welcome back to Ancient Greece and Rome. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of the Roman Republic. We'll talk about the late Roman Republic from the end of the Punic Wars to the Republic's ultimate dissolution with the rise of Octavian as the first Roman Emperor, Augustus Caesar. We'll talk about the effects that the Punic Wars had on the Roman military and on Roman society. We'll talk about territorial expansion, including the conquest of Greece that was happening about the same time as the end of the Third Punic War. We'll talk about political reformers like the Gracchi brothers. We'll also talk about the Marian reforms and the transition from a militia-based military to then a professional standing army, and what that will mean for Roman society and Roman politics. And we'll talk about late Republican Roman leaders and the civil wars that were fought by these leaders. We'll talk about people like Sulla and Pompey, and of course we'll talk about Julius Caesar and how he came to power. We will talk about the civil wars after Julius Caesar, specifically the civil wars between Octavian and Mark Antony, and then ultimately how Octavian becomes Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. And along the way, we'll bring in documentary and material sources corroborating what we're discussing with evidence. Also, we should discuss briefly the Roman takeover of Greece, which occurred from about 200 to 146 BCE. This was occurring sort of simultaneously with the Third Punic War. The Romans had been encroaching and expanding into Greek territory for over half a century. The decisive battle was fought at Corinth in 146 BCE. Basically, by the late 140s, most of the Greek city-states south of Macedonia had been made into what was called a client state. Remember, a client state is semi-independent, but is still obligated to obey Rome. And the Romans said to the Achaean League, now that you are our client state, you have freedom. The Greek city-states didn't understand what the Romans meant by freedom. They didn't really mean freedom. Remember, patrons always said, you are my friend, you are free, but they didn't actually mean it. They meant you have to obey me. And the Corinthians and the Achaean League took freedom literally, and they rebelled against the Romans. So they didn't understand Roman obligation culture, and that leads to the war in which they lose their independence completely. Roman general Lucius Mumius will lay waste to Corinth. He will destroy Corinth because Corinth was like the wealthiest, most powerful city of the Greeks at this point in history. It was also the headquarters of the rebellion against Rome. The Corinthians were also enslaved. Their city was destroyed, but Corinthian Greeks were then spread across the Roman civilization as slaves, and they introduced even more elements of Greek culture to the Romans. Like Carthage, Corinth is going to be rebuilt about 100 years later. And the Romans were admirers of Greek culture, and they spread Greek art and architecture and language across their expanding territorial holdings, especially in the eastern parts of the Roman civilization. In the eastern parts of the Roman civilization, Greek is going to be a very commonly used language, just as much as Latin. Even though the Romans liked Greek culture, they had kind of what historians call a love-hate relationship with the Greeks. They generally thought that the Greeks were weaker and not as strong as they were. They spent too much time on art and not enough time on preparing for war. Here is a bust of Lucius Mumius. You can see from the bust, they're not trying to portray a beautiful man. They're trying to portray a very stern, very war-weary man as a general like Mumius would have been. Here we see a painting of the destruction of Corinth, the population being sold as slaves. And of course, you can see evidence of the destruction of Corinth even now, although Corinth was going to be rebuilt by the Romans. Now that we've discussed the Roman takeover of the Greek mainland, and we discussed the Punic Wars in the last video, I want to mention some of the things that were going on back in Rome itself as these wars were taking place and then in the years after. And I specifically want to mention the Gracchus brothers, the Gracchi. We'll start by talking about Tiberius Gracchus. He lived from 163 BCE to 133 BCE. He was a veteran of the Third Punic War. He would have taken part in the Punic War as a very young man. And when he returned to Rome, he got involved in politics. Specifically, he wanted to help plebeians, poorer Romans, and just poor Romans living in the countryside and in the urban centers. In particular, he really wanted to help veterans of the war who had lost their land. A lot of middle class and poorer Romans who'd served Rome in the Punic Wars, they had their families had fallen into debt while the male breadwinner was off fighting in the war. The father, the husband, the oldest son, he would be fighting in the war, and the family might fall into debt and they might lose their land to wealthier Romans or to patricians slash basically the patron class, wealthier people. And patricians and wealthier people, they began building large landed estates, what were called latifundios. By the way, latifundia is still used in Spanish to refer to large land estates in like Latin America. So it's a Latin term that's still used by Romance language speaking peoples. And Tiberius had a mistrust for the older patrician class. Remember, patricians are wealthier people who can trace their lineage back to the founding families of Rome. And he saw their greed and their building of these large landed estates in the countryside as a threat to the patronage system. It was making poorer people too poor, so they couldn't take care of themselves, and the patricians themselves were not really taking care of the poor. They were making their clients poorer, but they weren't really helping their clients as patrons. And naturally, the patricians and the wealthier Romans, they didn't really like Tiberius very much. And he ends up being killed by a mob of men led by the Pontifex Maximus, or the high priest. And the mob that killed him were people who opposed his policies. And he was killed in 133 BCE. And the image on this slide is a bust that we believe is of Tiberius Gracchus. And this is a image of the killing of Tiberius Gracchus. He was beaten to death by a mob led by the high priest, or Pontifex Maximus. The people who wanted him dead would have been wealthier men who saw Tiberius as a threat. Tiberius, he didn't like the fact that they were building large latifundio estates. He wanted to break up the lands and return them to poorer Romans. That way poorer Romans could be more independent. We should also mention Gaius Gracchus, the brother of Tiberius, who lived a little bit later, 154 to 121 BCE. And he served as a tribune, one of the few Roman politicians that could actually be elected by plebeians, by everyday Roman people who were citizens, of course, Roman citizens. Gaius proposed a new political class for the Republic, the equites, also known as the equestrians, or the knights in English. Traditionally, equites, true to their name, were cavalry. They had horses. They generally were wealthier people, but they lived in rural areas on the Italian peninsula outside of Rome. And Gaius's idea was have the equites become a new political class, and they would balance the power of the Senate. And the equites would serve on trials of senators. Basically, the idea was the equites would oversee the trials of senators. Senators would frequently be put on trial for fraud and other types of crimes. On the whole, jury trials are less common in the Roman civilization than they were in, say, Athens, but the idea was this would balance the power of the Senate, and that was what Gaius wanted. And naturally, the Senate was not a fan of Gaius, and Gaius and his supporters were eventually driven out of Rome, and they were killed by a militia that was loyal to the Senate in the year 121 BCE. Some accounts say that Gaius, in the face of being killed, chose to commit suicide instead. But either way, the Senate has Gaius killed or pressures him into committing suicide. Either way, the Senate wanted Gaius Gracchus gone. They didn't like him just like they didn't like his brother Tiberius. And the image on this slide is a bust that's believed to be of Gaius Gracchus. And here we see a late 18th century painting showing the death of Gaius Gracchus. He's being pursued by a militia or paramilitary that's loyal to the Senate. And this is Gaius in his final moments before he either is killed or commits suicide. Now we'll talk a little bit about the Gracchi brothers in retrospect, the reforms they were proposing. These reforms were populist in nature. They were supposed to help the poor, and they were supposed to limit the power of the wealthy. And their reforms and then their violent deaths, they're basically being killed by wealthier factions within Roman politics, will lead to the creation of what are called the populares and the optimates, or populars and optimates, depending on how you want to say it. And the populares, they advocated for the poor, for the people, hence their name. Populum is people in Latin. And the optimates, or optimates, they advocated for the rule of the best, or aristocracy, for the best people to be in charge of Roman society. They wanted to keep the senatorial class and the elite of Rome in charge of the republic. And I would say that these two factions, the populares and the optimates, they're basically the closest thing that the Roman Republic will have to political parties. And scholars will debate the effects of the Gracchi reforms, if they went too far, or if their reforms were a necessary corrective to help the people. But they generally agree that the violence that leads to their death, both men they meet violent ends. It's signaling the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. Romans are no longer finding peaceful solutions for dealing with political issues. They're beginning to turn more and more to violence. And you'll see some other important social, political, and military changes are going to only lead to increased violence and then ultimately the dissolution of the Republic. Now I want to discuss the Marian reforms, circa 107 BCE. And the Marian reforms are very important. I would argue they're even more important than the failed reforms of the Gracchi brothers. To begin, Roman consul Gaius Marius instituted a series of military reforms in the early 100s BCE. These reforms were designed to help the Roman Republic defend its growing territorial holdings, Greece, North Africa, etc. Marius wanted to standardize the Roman infantry, basically creating the legionaries that we associate with the late Republic and then with the Roman Empire. Marius instituted the cohort system. This was different than the older maniple system. The cohort system was a lot more flexible, and it would allow the Romans to more easily break up their legions as needed in combat. So they could have a lot more small unit tactics. It was a lot more efficient, but then they could mass their forces when needed as well in battle. There's also an attempt to standardize Roman weapons and armor. Rather than having individual Roman soldiers provide whatever equipment and weapons they could afford, now arms and equipment are going to be a lot more standardized. And because of the Roman reforms, or reforms of Marius, you're going to see the iconic Roman scutum shields, these the concave rectangular shields that we associate with the Roman military, the Gallia style helmets. We'll also see the Lorica segmentata, iconic Roman breastplate, along with other types of Roman armor, like the Lorica squamata, which was scale armor, and the Lorica hamata, which was basically chainmail. Things are going to get a lot more standardized. Eventually, things like the Lorica segmentata will begin to replace the squamata and the hamata. That's going to really, though, not be complete until like the mid-1st century CE. So a lot of the Roman arms and equipment that we think of when we think of the Roman armies, the Roman legions, it wouldn't have happened without the Marian reforms. And the reason Marius was standardizing everything is because Marius was transitioning the Roman military away from the part-time citizen soldier militias that had served in previous wars, like the Punic Wars. Instead, he's moving towards a standing professional army of soldiers who will serve, depending on what period of Roman history you're looking at, between 16 and about 20 years, sometimes longer. And this system, in many ways, is actually very egalitarian. The new Roman legions will allow poorer Romans, assuming they're male citizens and free, to serve in the military. They will have their armor provided for them. They'll receive a salary. They won't have to worry about their family starving to death while they're gone. Actually, Roman legionaries are not going to be allowed to really have like wives and children, but they wouldn't have to worry about like their parents or their sisters and brothers back at home. On the negative side, however, the new Roman soldiers, while egalitarian, they gradually became more loyal to their general and to the legion they served in, rather than to Rome itself. Previous Roman legions, they had property requirements. They had to be able to provide their own armor. It was generally more middle-class Roman citizens, people who had a stake in Roman politics, much more so than a poorer Roman citizen. And these poorer Roman citizens who became soldiers, they recognized that their generals in the legion they were in, that was what allowed them to make more money and things like that in the form of plunder, in the form of gold and silver, spoils of war. So they became more loyal to their legion and to their generals than they were to the Republic. Another negative also is that the burden of equipping the military will now fall on the Roman state. This will incentivize future wars as a way to bring wealth into the empire. So you're going to see more warfare, really what you might call a Roman military-industrial complex, as the Romans need to go to war to be able to pay their soldiers. Another negative also is that in peacetime, Roman soldiers will have to be supported through taxation. And taxation is going to be a serious burden for Roman citizens. It's going to be very difficult for poor Romans who are already struggling to get by. Now they have to pay taxes they wouldn't have had to pay before. And wealthier Romans are also going to struggle with these taxes, because wealthier Romans are already having to pay to take care of their clients, and now they have to pay additional taxes to Rome. But we'll talk more about taxation in the Roman Empire, what kind of taxes citizens had to pay, what kind of taxes non-citizens had to pay in future videos. So these are the Marian reforms. They give us a standardized professional Roman army. The equipment is standardized. Poorer men can serve in the Roman army now. Property requirements are done away with. They receive their own gear. They receive a salary. But these new Roman soldiers, these new legionaries, they become more loyal to their generals and to their legions than they are to the Roman Senate and the Roman state. And that's going to lead to the violent civil wars you see that will ultimately bring an end to the Roman Republic. Here is an example of how Roman helmets changed thanks to the Marian reforms. On the right here is an older Montefortino helmet made of bronze. It's plainer and simpler and provides less protection than the later Gallia helmet. This Montefortino helmet is incomplete though. It would have had cheek plates that would have hung down from the side here. They've been lost. Of course, these cheek plates are flexible. They're in a hinge here, similar to the later Gallia helmet. The Gallia helmets, some were made of bronze, but over time they're made of iron. Iron, of course, is stronger than bronze. Also, the neck protection plate is much larger on a Gallia helmet, and there's better hearing protection as well. So you can see how the Marian reforms lead to better military technology for the Romans. Here are some examples of Roman body armor. On the left here, you can see the remains of a lorica segmentata with a reconstruction. This piece, I believe, is from the 120s CE, found in Britannia or Britain. The lorica segmentata, the Romans probably began to introduce the lorica segmentata around the 50s BCE, but I don't think it became very common until well into the 1st century CE. Remember, these Marian reforms of standardization, they actually take a kind of a long time to really get going. And I think it takes a while for the lorica segmentata to become standard. Really, that's going to be much later in like the 1st century CE. And this piece is actually from the 120s CE. So it's actually from the beginning of the 2nd century. The Romans would have phased out older styles of armor, like the lorica hamata, which is basically chainmail, and also they would have possibly phased out the lorica squamata as well. This is scale armor. This example is actually from the 1st to 5th century CE. Auxiliaries, that is non-Roman citizens who fought not in the legions, but fought in other types of units, auxiliary units as they were called. They would have used squamata scale armor and hamata chain armor for quite a while longer. So the Marian reforms, they do bring out increased standardization in the Roman military, but the standardization is not truly universal. And what standardization that does take place takes place pretty slowly over the course of really a couple hundred years. And here's the Roman scutum shield. The Romans liked oblong shields. This shield, though, is much more rectangular, and it's also it's convex, meaning it points outward. This convex design provides better protection, but also it allows them to form what's called the testutum, or the tortoise shield wall. It's a lot like a Greek phalanx, but much more protective. Also, the convex shape on the upper layer of scutum shields allows the legionaries to see and to charge their enemies, but also to stick a gladius sword out so they can not only see, but they can fend off their enemies as well when they're in the testutum formation. Here are some modern reenactors wearing various types of Roman armor. These reenactors here are pre-Marian, based on the helmets. These are more like simpler Montefortino helmets, often decorated with feathers. They're using oval-shaped shields, and these look like lorica hamata chainmail. These legionaries are from much later, or they're impersonating later Roman soldiers who have Gallia helmets and lorica segmentata and scutum shields. Much better armor, but much more expensive. Of course, you can see the similarities between Roman armor and modern armor. Modern football pads, similar shape to lorica segmentata, and riot police today use riot shields that are similar. They have a convex shape similar to that of the Roman scutum shield. Here's a structure of the Roman legion. You can see the cohorts. There were usually 10 cohorts. They were, of course, accompanied by cavalry and light troops. Light troops did not have the kind of armor, and usually they were not legionaries. They were what were called auxiliaries. We'll talk about auxiliaries in the next video. The century, of course, included usually more like 80 soldiers. The century means 100 in Latin, but there were usually 80 soldiers and perhaps 20 support personnel, which would have included cooks, physicians, servants, and slaves who provided labor and logistical assistance to the actual soldiers. And you can see how the cohorts would have fit into the larger legion. And legions typically had about 5,000 troops. And there was a lot of legion pride. Sometimes the legion had different colors they wore. Legions had their own symbols. They also had the Roman eagle. To lose the Roman eagle was a great disgrace and dishonor on a legion. You did not want to have that kind of defeat. With this discussion of the Marian reforms, the creation of a Roman standing army, increased standardization of Roman arms and equipment, we should mention the social war of 91 to 88 BCE. And this war was fought between the Roman Republic and their allies or soci. And basically, Rome had control of the Italian peninsula by the 200s BCE, but not all of the people living on the Italian peninsula were considered to be Roman citizens. Some of them were basically allies of Rome or clients of Rome. And there were rebellions by other people on the Italian peninsula, namely the Samnites and the Marsi. You can see an example of Samnite soldiers on the left side of this slide. And in this conflict, the Roman Republic will use legions that are being transformed by the Marian reforms. And in the end, the Romans are victorious. They defeat the Samnite and Marsi rebellion. And as a result of winning the war, they decide to give all Italian people, that is, all people living on the Italian peninsula, Roman citizenship. So out of this war, all Italian people, that is all free Italian people, slaves are not included, they are given Roman citizenship. And so henceforth, all Italians are going to be referred to as Romans. And really, the social war, it leads to the last vestiges of non-Roman Italic cultures being dissolved. So on the one hand, these people are gaining Roman citizenship, which is good. On the other hand, there's going to be increased pressure for them to give up their own native culture and adopt Roman culture. We saw the Romans do this with the Etruscans, and they're going to do it with people like the Samnites as well. And the social war, it shows the Romans' power, not only their power in warfare, but their power to acculturate and assimilate other cultures as well, and to make them Roman. And again, the image on this slide is of Samnite soldiers. It's a fresco from a tomb at a site called Nola. This fresco is actually from the 4th century BCE, but it gives you an idea of what Samnites might have looked like, even if it is a few hundred years before the social war. And this is a map of Roman Italy shortly before the social war took place. The image on the right-hand side shows some scenes from the social war. You can see the Romans here fighting the Samnites. The soldiers in this image, their tunics and their shields have been copied from the tunics and shields seen on the fresco tomb from the previous slide. And you can see, however, on the map that there are basically colonies of ethnic Romans throughout the Italian peninsula. And then you'll also see that there are basically the ally states. who are living on the Italian peninsula, who are allied with Rome and are clients of Rome, but they're not fully Roman. In the social war, these allies will be defeated, and they will be made Roman. They'll gain Roman citizenship, but it will come at the expense of their culture being dissolved and being assimilated into the Roman culture. Now I want to talk about the first of three periods of civil war in the Roman Republic. And these three periods of civil war will lead to the dissolution of the Roman Republic. The first war is a series of conflicts between Consul Marius of the Marian reforms and a general named Sulla. And these wars take place from 88 to 87, and then again from 83 to 81 BCE. And the cause of Sulla's wars with the Republic was the fact that Consul Marius recalled Sulla from his fight against Mithridates of Pontus in Anatolia, depriving Sulla and his troops of the spoils of war. It would seem that Marius was getting very concerned about the military glory that Sulla was gaining while fighting in Anatolia, and he recalled Sulla so that he could take control of his legions. In response, Sulla and his legions will march on Rome. They will defeat Marius's forces, and they will take control of the Republic. And at this point, there had not been a dictator over the Roman Republic for over a century, not since the Second Punic War. Remember, during the Second Punic War, the Italian heartland, the heartland of the Roman Republic, was invaded by Hannibal and the Carthaginians. As dictator, Sulla was not a good leader. Not like Camillus and Cincinnatus, the good dictators before him, who only thought about fighting against Rome's enemies. Sulla focused his efforts on killing and exiling political opponents, including people like Julius Caesar. Caesar managed to survive Sulla's purges. And Sulla was able to rule as dictator because he strengthened the patrician class, and they supported his dictatorship. Basically, if Sulla was a part of a Roman political faction, he would have been part of the optimates, the aristocratic faction. And Sulla will resign his dictatorship in about the year 79 BCE. He will leave public life and then die a year later. Sulla's coup would inspire Julius Caesar's takeover of Rome as well. And the images on this slide are Roman denarii, or silver coins from the period. The top features the profile of Sulla, and on the bottom we see Sulla on one side of the coin, and on the other side of the coin we see the profile of the goddess Diana, or Artemis, as she was known to the Greeks. Here are a couple more important facts about Sulla, or Marcus Cornelius Sulla, his full name. He lived from 138 to 78 BCE, and he is the first Roman general to take control of Rome by force in over 400 years. Although Rome had been at war with other civilizations, whether it was the Carthaginians or the Allies during the Social War, there hadn't been as much internal turmoil within the Roman Republic, at least not until this point. And Sulla will, of course, take control of Rome twice, from 88 to 87, and then again in 83 BCE. And the first time that he took control of Rome, it was because Consul Marius had recalled Sulla from his war against Mithridates of Pontus over in Anatolia. And after taking over Rome, making Marius flee, Sulla will again return to Asia Minor. Marius will retake Rome, and then Marius will die, and Sulla will return to Rome again, and he will make himself dictator. And as I said before, Sulla was a very brutal dictator. He will lead a reign of terror against his political opponents, which involved proscription. Proscription was basically a Roman law where people would be made outlaws, and then anyone who killed the proscribed, outlawed people, they would not face any penalties for killing these people, and they could take the property of the people they had killed. And again, Sulla was able to rule as dictator because he had support from the patrician class, the upper class. Roman people supported him. He definitely was on the optimates side of Roman politics. And Sulla will give up power peacefully in 79 BCE and then will retire from public life. And one of Sulla's most important supporters was a young man by the name of Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey as he's better known. And the image on this slide is a bust that is thought to be of Sulla. This is an Augustan copy of an original older bust. It may or may not be of Sulla, but when people think of Sulla, they generally think of this bust, so I've included it. This is Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey. He lived from 106 to 48 BCE, and he rose to prominence while serving as a military commander for Sulla. Pompey came from a very wealthy family, and he raised a private army using his family's riches to support Sulla. And he helped Sulla create a system that really was not rule of the best and not a system of obligation, but what some historians and scholars call violence and power politics. Basically that whoever is the most powerful, they're going to rule Rome, not necessarily patrons looking after clients and everyone trying to help each other the way things have been before. Systems of obligation are breaking down and becoming a lot more violent. And examples of this kind of violence is like the Catiline conspiracy of 63 BCE, where Romans are trying to seize control of their government using force and using violence because they've seen other people do it successfully. They've seen Sulla do it. And Julius Caesar will see that people did it before him, and so he'll do it. And Pompey will rule as a consul with Marcus Crassus and then Julius Caesar in what was called a triumvirate, or rule of three. And Pompey was a successful military commander. He won fame and plunder during the third war against Mithridates in Pontus, and he also captured territory in North Central Africa and Jerusalem. Basically, Pompey brought an end to the Seleucid Empire, and he also brought the Israelite Hasmonean kingdom into the Roman Republic. After the death of Crassus, he became the sole consul in 52 BCE, alarming Julius Caesar, and this will inspire Julius Caesar at the time, who was outside of Rome, to then march on Rome in 49 BCE. And ultimately, Pompey will be defeated by Julius Caesar at the Battle of Farsalis in Greece in 48 BCE. Pompey would then retreat to Egypt, where he would be assassinated by troops loyal to Egyptian Hellenistic king Ptolemy XIII, technically an ally of his. And Ptolemy XIII was the brother of Queen Cleopatra VII, and Cleopatra was an ally of Julius Caesar. So in some ways, by being an enemy of Cleopatra, Ptolemy was sort of an ally of Pompey. So it makes his decision to have Pompey assassinated all the more troubling. And Julius Caesar certainly was very troubled to see that Pompey was assassinated by Ptolemy. Even though Pompey was his enemy, he felt that it was dishonorable for Pompey to have been killed by Ptolemy. This is a very famous bust of Pompey. It can be found at the Met, New York City, if you want to see it in person. So now we'll talk about Julius Caesar and his rise to power and the beginning of the second period of civil wars in the Roman Republic. Caesar's full name was Gaius Julius Caesar. He lived from 100 to 44 BCE. Caesar was from a patrician family. Initially, he was a priest. It seems he wanted to pursue religious life, but he's forced to give up his position as a priest due to the persecution and proscriptions of Sulla. While traveling in the Eastern Mediterranean, he's going to be kidnapped by pirates while he was on a diplomatic mission, and it's said that the pirates kidnapped Caesar, and they said that they were going to hold him as a hostage, and Caesar said, well, whatever ransom money you were going to ask for, double it, because that's how important I am. And the pirates thought that he was very arrogant and haughty for saying such a thing. In the end, Caesar will be freed from the pirates, and then he will go after the pirates and have them crucified. So Caesar got his revenge on the pirates that kidnapped him. In 58 BCE, to improve his financial position, Caesar would take his 4 legions to Gaul to fight various Celtic peoples that were moving around in that region. Some of them wanted to enter Roman territory, and Caesar would not permit them to do that. Or he considered allowing them to enter Roman territory, but then changed his mind. Or he always planned to attack these people in order to provoke a war between his legions and the Celts. Either way, though, Caesar used these wars in Gaul to improve his finances and to improve his political standing. Caesar had been involved in Roman politics. He was a consul along with Marcus Crassus and Pompey. Pompey was on Sulla's side in the previous period of civil war, and Crassus was kind of a balancing factor, kind of keeping these two former enemies together as allies. But being a politician in Rome was very expensive because you had to provide food and wine and entertainment for your clients, and it would put Caesar into a great deal of debt. So going to war, not only would it have allowed Caesar to distinguish himself as an imperator, as a successful general, it would have allowed him to bring in money and to pay off his debts. So there were many reasons why he wanted to go to war in Gaul, even if how the war specifically started is a bit hazy and perhaps even a bit unethical on the part of Caesar. But we'll talk about the ethics of the Gallic War later on. So by 55 BCE, Caesar is invading Celtic territory in Gaul in what is now France, and he will gradually take over the region, bringing Gaul into the Roman Republic. Caesar will also invade Britain, but he's going to fail to conquer the Celtic people in the British Isles. And now these Celtic people are broken up into tribes. Various tribes, some are Caesar's enemy, some will actually try to ally with Caesar. It was actually kind of at the bidding of a Celtic tribal leader that he will invade Britannia, the British Isles, in the first place. But the harsh weather of the British Isles, rain, unfavorable rain, winds, and things like that will make it very difficult for Caesar to conduct military operations in Gaul. Britannia. And some might think, well, did Caesar even really go to Britannia, or did he just make up this story to make himself sound like a better general than he actually was? Well, there is archaeological evidence that Caesar was, in fact, in Britannia. By 52 BCE, most of the Celts had been brought under Roman control, but some of these disparate Celtic tribes will try to unite so that they can rebel against Caesar in Rome. And they will be led by a Celtic chieftain named Vercingetorix. but it was too little, too late. Even though Vercingetorix's forces will actually outnumber Caesar's, they're just not organized enough to defeat Caesar and the Romans. And in the end, Vercingetorix is forced to surrender to Caesar, and Celtic resistance in Gaul is going to be crushed. In 49 BCE, Caesar will cross the Rubicon River, invading the Italian peninsula. This was a treasonous offense, meaning that if Caesar were to be defeated and captured, he would certainly be executed for treason. And this will, of course, kick off the Second Roman Civil War, in which Caesar will fight Pompey and then will become a dictator. Pompey and the Senate will flee Rome. Caesar will enter Rome, become a dictator in 48 BCE, and he will defeat Pompey shortly thereafter. And Pompey, though, will be assassinated, as I mentioned, by Ptolemy XIII of Egypt. This is the Sabra district where Caesar grew up. It's basically a slum. When Caesar is living there, it has very drab brick buildings. It's not a nice place to live. It's not a place that patricians live. You can see that there's a mixture of Roman and then later medieval architecture at Sabra. It's not been preserved as it was during Roman times. This, of course, is the biggest challenge of urban archaeology. Continuously inhabited sites have layers and layers of human activity, of really valuable artifacts from many different eras. And to try to investigate one period, you often have to destroy other artifacts in other periods. Heinrich Schliemann, of course, did that when he was investigating Troy. Nowadays, archaeologists are much more careful, but it's why archaeology in a place like Rome can actually be very challenging, because a place like Sabra, there's multiple layers of inhabitation. This is a map of Caesar's campaign in Gaul. It shows his brief invasion of Britannia, or England as we call it today. You can see that he's all over what is now France, and also parts of Netherlands and even parts of Germany as well, defeating the various Celtic peoples. One of the reasons the Celts were moving into Roman territory is because of the Germanic people. The Germanic people were basically pushing the Celts westward into Roman territory. Here is a diagram explaining the siege of Alicia, the last battle of Caesar's Gallic War. Julius Caesar trapped Vercingetorix and his army, along with their civilian force, women and children, at Alicia. Caesar fortified his camp around the city, or the town of Alicia, and then the Celts surround Caesar. So the besieger, Caesar, becomes the besieged. But in the end, Caesar is able to outlast the Celts. There's reports that Vercingetorix pushed all of his women and children and civilians out of Alicia so that the Romans would have to take care of them and feed them. And Caesar just chose to let the civilians starve to death rather than weaken his own army. Also, Roman cavalry reinforcements arrived, and they defeated the Gauls that were trying to break into Caesar's defenses from the outside. There's evidence of some structures around Alicia. These are a mixture of Roman and Celtic structures at this battlefield. And this battlefield, by the way, is in the north of France. Here are reconstructions of what we think Caesar's fortifications would have looked like. They would have included these wooden towers in the background and walls, and then in the foreground there would have been a series of moats that would have prevented an assault by the Gauls. Of course, he also put these sticks into the ground that would impale people who were charging his position. The siege itself was fought in September of 52 BCE, so late summer, early fall. With the winter coming, that would have added a sense of urgency to both sides. The Romans were a much smaller force, surrounded by over 250 Celts outside of their fortification. The Celts outside of the fortification were not unified enough to break through Caesar's defenses, and they were routed by Roman cavalry reinforcements. In the end, Vercingetorix surrenders, and eventually he's executed in Rome in 46 BCE to glorify Julius Caesar. And of course, the conquest of Gaul was solidified by the siege of Alicia, and Caesar's victories and the wealth he brings into the Republic allowed him to eventually take control of the Roman Republic as a dictator. This is the remains of a foundation of a Roman military barracks in southeast England. It's believed to have been built during the time of Julius Caesar, highlighting that Julius Caesar did in fact invade Britain, although he did fail to conquer it. It wouldn't be fully conquered until the reign of Emperor Claudius. And even then, the Romans did not conquer the entirety of the island of Great Britain, only part of it. Here is an artist's representation of Julius Caesar meeting with Vercingetorix, who is trying to surrender. You see that Julius Caesar is wearing a Roman toga. It's a reddish-purple color. Julius Caesar liked to wear purple togas. Purple was a color of wealth and opulence in Rome. It was made from dye made from seashells, from a mollusk, actually initially discovered by the Phoenicians. It will become purplish red will become a symbol of the emperors after Julius Caesar. Caesar himself was not an emperor; he was a dictator. But later Roman emperors will copy Julius Caesar's style. Here is a map of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. You can see the territories that the Romans brought in during the Republic period. You can see Caesar's Gaul as well. And then you can see territories that were brought in later during the imperial period, which will be the subject of the next video. Here's a modern painting of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon into Rome. This is definitely a more negative portrayal of Caesar. We see death and destruction in his behind him, skulls and bones, people crying out and hiding, and we see the earth, and we see that Caesar's ambition is leading him to conquer Rome. Ambition was something that the Romans did not like. Ambition has a very positive connotation to us today, but to the Romans, ambition was an unhealthy desire for power and glory. And the artist in this painting is trying to capture how the Romans would have viewed the ambition of Caesar. Keep in mind that many poor Romans loved Julius Caesar and thought of him as a hero, whereas wealthier Romans were threatened by his ambition, because his ambition came at the expense of their power. This is the Appian Way. It's a road in southern and central Italy. It connects Rome with cities to the south. Caesar and his troops would have used roads like the Appian Way as they were marching toward Rome, and then as they're marching to other parts of the Italian peninsula, consolidating their hold over Italia and Rome. One of the reasons that the people supported Julius Caesar was not just his populist policies, his public works projects, but when he was taking over the Italian peninsula, he and his troops were actually very disciplined. They didn't attack civilians indiscriminately, as had been done during earlier conflicts like the Social War. They didn't proscribe Caesar's enemies, ordering that they be killed and their property given to the killers. So a lot of Romans, especially poorer Romans, saw Julius Caesar as a much less violent alternative than other rulers. And of course they supported his policies as well. But as you can see from this road, the Appian Way, the Romans were very skilled road builders. They built these roads to connect their various provinces. These were major arteries of trade. Armies would move down them on their way to the frontier or during these civil wars. In fact, armies often built roads themselves. So roads are very important in the Roman Republic, and they're going to be very important in the empire as well. This is a battle map showing the Battle of Farsalis. It was fought 9th of August, 48 BCE in northwest Greece. And in this battle, Caesar's much smaller force defeated Pompey's much greater army. Caesar had about 23,000 troops, whereas Pompey had about 45,000. And Pompey made a cavalry charge on Caesar's infantry. Caesar's troops would have been more experienced with combat than Pompey's would have. They withstood the cavalry charge from Pompey, and then they led a fierce counterattack in which they broke Pompey's army and then forced Pompey to retreat. And this was the decisive battle of Pompey's war with Caesar, or Caesar's war with Pompey. Pompey is defeated. He will flee the battlefield, and eventually he will be killed by Ptolemy the 13th. So now we'll discuss Julius Caesar as dictator and some of the things he did. He ruled with his second in command, Mark Antony. His title was Master of Horse as second in command. He probably actually didn't take care of Caesar's horse, but that was just how they referred to his second in command. It's a military term. Caesar refused to wear a crown because he did not want to be seen as a king. He knew that Roman society, especially the elite classes, hated kings. Anything that made him seem like a king, he didn't want to do. Instead, he wore crowns of a golden crown of olive leaves, which was to symbolize victory. Unlike Sulla, who really tried to ingratiate himself to the upper classes of Rome, Caesar tried to be a man of the people. This is probably because he lived in relative poverty as a child, and he was forced to flee from his life during Sulla's reign of terror. He identified with poor people in a way that Sulla could not, and he probably identified with poor people in a way that the average wealthy Roman senator could not. So a lot of people really in the lower classes and the plebeian classes liked Julius Caesar and supported his dictatorship. Caesar also gained support of the people by building expensive public works projects, which would have impressed the plebeians. He needed their support to stay in power. Some good things that Caesar did in addition to his public works project was he allowed or set up a path that non-Romans in Gaul could become citizens, those that hadn't been killed or enslaved. But becoming a citizen was difficult. It's a difficult process. To weaken the power of the old patrician Senate, he actually increased the Senate from 600 to 900. You might say that he packed the Senate with supporters. Caesar, he was part of a political faction called the Populares. These were people in the Roman government that claimed to be for the people, versus another faction called the Optimates or Optimates, who claimed to be for the upper classes. They were kind of like political parties, but not as organized as modern political parties were. You know, remember, Caesar was from a patrician family. He was from a family that had nobility, but had fallen on hard times. And also, Caesar lived in some pretty rough circumstances as a young man because he was hiding out from Sulla. So it was natural that he would support the Populares and be a man of the people. But even after, as a dictator, he still acted as a general. He's famous to have said, Vene, vide, vice, I came, I saw, I conquered, after defeating Pontus in Asia Minor. So he was a civil leader and a military leader as dictator. And he cast himself as a man of the people, and he was loved by the people. Although a lot of more powerful senators and patricians did not like Julius Caesar, seeing him as a threat to their own power. This is what's left of the Basilica Julia, which was built in about 46 BCE. This was one of the buildings that Caesar built to gain the support of the everyday Romans. He also did a lot of renovations on the Forum complex. Once again, it's so difficult to do urban archaeology, and especially like a place like Rome, because these buildings are constantly being changed, they're being renovated, they're being demolished and replaced. Sometimes buildings are burnt by fire, which we'll talk about in the next video. But the Basilica Julia was one of the buildings that Caesar built to get the support of everyday people. And the renovations that Caesar made are called the Forum Eulum for Caesar or for Julius. And these also would have helped him get support from everyday people. This is what the Forum Eulum might have looked like at the time of Julius Caesar after his renovations. Here's the Theater of Marcellus, which was begun by Julius Caesar but finished by Octavian. Octavian was a relative of Julius Caesar, but eventually became Julius Caesar's adopted son, and Octavian would become the first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus. Theaters and entertainment, of course, were important parts of Roman culture, and entertainment provided by wealthy, powerful people in the government to the regular people. That's part of the patronage obligation system. So now we'll discuss the assassination of Julius Caesar. On 15th of March, the Ides of March, 44 BCE, the senators, led by Marcus Brutus and Cassius, stabbed Caesar to death in the Senate. The senators claimed that they killed Caesar because he had become too ambitious, and also because Caesar had announced that he was going to be dictator for life. He was not going to resign from power at any point. He was going to only leave power in death. Everyday Romans were angered at Caesar's assassination. They liked Julius Caesar. They thought he was one of them, a man of the people, even though he was a dictator with absolute power. Everyday Romans supported Caesar's protege and cousin, Mark Antony. And Mark Antony will create the third triumvirate with Lepidus and Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian, who becomes Augustus Caesar. Julius Caesar was declared a god on 42 BCE, which would lead to the later tradition of Roman emperors being declared gods. The second triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, Lepidus, will go to war against Brutus and Cassius and will defeat them actually in Greece at the Battle of Philippi. Also, Lepidus is eventually going to be kicked out of the triumvirate. So it's not going to be three people. It's going to eventually just be Octavian and Antony. But even Octavian and Antony are going to feud amongst each other, which will lead to the third and final Republican Civil War. This is the Plaza Argentina, said to be the place where Caesar was assassinated. This is what's believed to be the remains of Caesar's funeral pyre, where Caesar's body was burned after his death, along with furniture and gifts from everyday Romans. Remember, the Romans generally preferred cremation as their way of dealing with the dead. And Antony gave a oration about Julius Caesar, what a good leader he was. He calls for the Roman people to support him and his triumvirate against the traitors Brutus and Cassius. This is another moment in Western history that's been duplicated and copied throughout Western literature and art, poetry, theater, etc. And obviously the pyre of Caesar is still a site that people visit nowadays and even place flowers on. I also want to mention Marcus Tullius Cicero, a Roman orator and statesman who was involved in politics during the final years of the Roman Republic. Cicero was a politician and statesman. He was the leader of the Optimates party. He was definitely on the elite side of Roman politics. And he had supported Pompey during the second period of Roman Civil War, seeing him as a preferable alternative to the more populistic Julius Caesar. And in terms of his personal beliefs, Cicero was a believer in Stoic philosophy. Stoic philosophy was an older Greek philosophy that taught the importance of having grace and having dignity during pain. And Cicero was a big believer in the idea of natural law, and that what you saw in nature was right and moral, and he believed in the idea of humanitas as well, and having humanity. And his Stoic philosophy reinforced his ideas of natural law and humanitas. And Cicero was famous, renowned for his rhetorical skills. His speeches, his speaking and writing style, and his letters, they were imitated by Romans and then many other later Western authors and politicians. They will read Cicero's speeches and his letters, and they will try to imitate his style. Cicero, as an optimate, he was an enemy of Octavian, Lepidus, and Mark Antony. He criticized, in particular, Mark Antony in a series of very harsh, very invective-laden speeches called philippics. And philippics were actually a Greek style of speech in which the speaker would denounce an enemy politician. They were developed by a Greek orator named Demosthenes from Athens. You probably remember Demosthenes spoke out against Philip of Macedon. That's why these speeches where you criticize a politician are called philippics. In particular, his second philippic against Mark Antony is the most famous and a very interesting speech. He accuses Mark Antony of all sorts of things. He says that Mark Antony is a big, burly, handsome man, but he can't hold his liquor. He gets drunk and throws up all over the place. He says that Mark Antony has loose morals. He says that Mark Antony has sexual relationships with other men. Sexual relations between men took place in the Roman civilization, but like the Greeks before them, the Romans had very strict rules about how those same-sex relationships took place. And according to Cicero, Antony broke all those rules, and he basically tries to defame Antony and make him look really bad in his Philippic speeches. And Antony is very angry and never really forgives Cicero for this. And Cicero is considered to be one of the best Latin language orators of all time. As I said, his style has been mimicked by later Romans and many other world leaders. But his speaking style was not enough to save him, and he ends up being killed by Antony's troops after he was first proscribed. And the image on this slide is a bust of Cicero. It's from the 1st century CE. It's in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, and as you can see, it's carved in that late Republican style. Cicero is shown with a receding hairline, a heavy brow, wrinkles around his eyes and on his cheeks. He's shown with a double chin. It's very much that portrait style that shows wealthy Romans as being old and tired and haggard, possibly as a reference to how tired they were that the Roman Republic was coming to an end. And of course, a bust like this would have been painted as well when it was made. This slide shows the death of Cicero. It's said to have taken place December 7th, 43 BCE. Cicero tried to escape the Italian peninsula. He was hoping to get to Macedonia, and his slaves were helping him escape by carrying him on a litter like this that you can see in the slide image. Antony's troops caught up to Cicero, and it was reported that Cicero was brave in the face of death. He said, well, if you're going to kill me, at least make sure you cut off my head properly. And with that, Cicero, the great Roman orator, met his fate at the hands of Mark Antony's troops. His speaking style, his oratory style, while very brilliant, made him a lot of enemies and ultimately, I would argue, led to his death. This is a shot of the interior of Cicero's villa at Formianum. It's outside of Rome. This was where he was living in his final days. And while it may not look like much now, it would have been very, very nice when Cicero would have lived there. It had palatial gardens, it had fountains, it would have had baths and all sorts of creature comforts for a man of Cicero's political stature. And you can see the Doric-style columns that are being used in this this building. You can see the coffers in the arched ceiling. So you can see the remnants of what would have been a very beautiful villa that Cicero spent his last days in before he was killed. This is a building that was said to be the tomb of Cicero. It's a stone tower built in a cemetery complex outside of Formia. Like the Greeks, the Romans typically built their tombs away from settlements and from cities. They thought that the dead would make the world of the living impure, and that the dead needed to be buried away from where the living were living and working and living their lives. This structure is built near other mausoleums, and it's built along the Appian Way, so that Romans, as they were passing by, they would see this building, this tomb. So even though the Romans wanted to keep the dead away from their settlements and cities, they still wanted people to be able to see their tombs as they passed along the road. There is, however, some disagreement as to whether this building was actually a tomb for Cicero or if it was just a cenotaph, basically a monument built to Cicero, but his body or his ashes were buried someplace else. There's debate about that. This site was basically forgotten about, and it was used as a stable and a garden in the past, but it gained renewed public interest in the 1930s under the rule of Benito Mussolini. And Mussolini and his Italian fascist government, they were very interested in excavating and rediscovering Roman archaeology and Roman sites as a way of legitimizing their rule in Italy. Now that we've talked about the Second Triumvirate and the death of Cicero, we should talk about the Battle of Philippi and the defeat of Brutus and Cassius, or the Liberators as they called themselves. And this battle, of course, is fought at Philippi in Macedonia / northern Greece. The Second Triumvirate had about 108,000 troops, and the Liberators had about 105,000 troops. This was one of the largest battles in the Roman civil wars, in which over 200,000 troops were engaged. A very large battle, divided between 19 legions for the Second Triumvirate and 17 legions for the Liberators. And the battles took place on the 3rd of October, and then again on the 23rd of October, 42 BCE. And it's a very messy series of battles, with all four of the generals will make some pretty serious tactical errors. And there's a lot of very brutal hand-to-hand, close quarters battling and maneuvering during these battles. In these battles, Antony primarily fought Cassius, and Octavian primarily fought Brutus. But Cassius will commit suicide after a false report of Brutus's defeat. And this is not a good thing for the Liberator faction. They were actually, in the beginning of the battle, they had the upper hand, but the death of Cassius, who was a more experienced tactician than the younger Brutus, will lead to a defeat for the Liberators faction, as Octavian and Antony will turn both of their attention towards defeating Brutus. And eventually the battle will be won by the Second Triumvirate. Brutus will commit suicide, and the rest of Brutus's legions will surrender and be integrated into the victorious triumvir's armies. And the historian Plutarch actually wrote that Brutus was said to have had a vision of his ghost shortly before his death, that he was going to die and be defeated. And this scene with Brutus and his ghost is referenced in William Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, about the the life and death of Julius Caesar and the death of Brutus. This is a battle map of the battles at Philippi. As you can see, Octavian and Brutus are primarily fighting each other, and Antony and Cassius are primarily fighting each other. And Antony will try to outflank Cassius, moving in and around some marshes, but Cassius's camp will be too well fortified, and he won't be able to take Cassius's camp. As I said early on in these battles, the Liberator faction, that is Brutus and Cassius, have the upper hand, but Cassius's untimely suicide will be the beginning of the end for the Liberator faction in these battles, and eventually both Antony and Octavian will turn their attention towards defeating Brutus, who will also commit suicide. And these are some modern scenes from the Battle of Philippi. It's a very messy, very confused set of engagements in the Battle of Philippi, or these two engagements on the 3rd and 23rd of October. The various forces will assault each other's camps. The Romans built fortified camps, as you saw in Caesar's war in Gaul, and they will do this well into the imperial period. And Brutus was said to see a vision of his ghost foretelling his defeat and his death. And in the end, Brutus will be defeated and he will commit suicide, and the liberators will be defeated by the Second Triumvirate. This is a map of the Roman Republic. It shows the territory that was under the control of Triumvir Octavian in purple. You see in this orange color, Italia is controlled by the Senate, and then the areas in green are controlled by Mark Antony. So Octavian is in the west, Antony is in the east, in Greece, and he's very close to Egypt, although Egypt at this point is not part of the Roman Republic. It's an ally of Mark Antony via Cleopatra, his lover. And you can also see the territory controlled by Lepidus. Lepidus was very much the junior or weakest triumvir in the relationship between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. And these blue territories here are actually, they were controlled by Sextus Pompey, the son of Gaius Pompey, who was killed by Ptolemy XIII. He was eventually going to be defeated as well. And Sextus will be defeated and killed by Octavian and Lepidus's forces, primarily by the year 35 BCE. Former allies, Antony and Octavian, former friends and supporters of Julius Caesar, you might say clients of Julius Caesar, eventually become enemies. One of the reasons for this was because Mark Antony was spending a lot more time in the eastern sections of the Roman Republic, especially Greece and Egypt, with Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the ruler of Egypt, but she was of Greek ancestry. And Antony was plotting to have Caesarion, the supposed son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, made the next dictator of Rome. Basically, he wanted to create a kingdom where Caesar's alleged supposed son would be the next king or dictator, and Antony would be kind of the shadow leader behind the control of the government. Naturally, Octavian opposed this, and because he wanted to rule Rome himself. Octavian published Antony's plans, particularly his relationship with Cleopatra. That turned a lot of Romans in the western part of the Republic against Antony. They thought he was plotting a foreign takeover of their republic. And they also didn't want to be ruled by a child that was half foreign and not legitimate, because Cleopatra and Julius Caesar were not married. And so Antony is then forced to fight against Octavian. They fight a series of battles, mostly in and around Greece. The Battle of Actium was the decisive battle that basically brought an end to Antony's power. It was fought about September 2nd, 31 BCE. Octavian had trapped Antony's legions in a small port town on the west coast of Greece, and then he surrounded the port with his ships. Basically, they were blockaded on both land and sea, a lot like what happened to Carthage. Octavian's ships were smaller, and he had a lot more ships than Antony, about 400 versus 250. The sea was very rough that day, and the big ships of Antony just could not maneuver in the rough seas, so Octavian's forces were able to defeat Antony's ships. And the morale of Antony's sailors and marines really dropped when they saw Cleopatra fleeing the battle. So in the end, Antony's military power is destroyed, and he's forced to flee to Egypt, only to be pursued by Octavian. This is where the Battle of Actium was fought. This is on the western coast of Greece. The wind was probably also more advantageous for Octavian than it was for Antony. These are the days of sailing ships. Sails would often be taken down for combat when rowers would be used, but it would have allowed Octavian's ships to get into position much more easily before they took their sails down for battle. And this is a prow or ram of a ship from the battle. It's not clear which faction, which side it belonged to. This is a relief commemorating Octavian's victory at Actium. Remember, it shows the aft castle, it shows Marines fighting, and of course it features rowers. This is the foundation of the Actium victory monument that Octavian had built for himself to commemorate his defeat of Antony. All that's left is the foundation, as you can see. After the defeat at Actium, Antony and Cleopatra flee to Egypt, and Octavian's forces follow them and defeat what's left of their troops. Cleopatra flees into what was believed to be her tomb, and then prepares to commit suicide. Antony believes that Cleopatra has committed suicide and stabs himself, preparing to die, only to find that Cleopatra is still alive, and the stories say that he then died in her arms in a very romantic way. In order to avoid being captured by Octavian, Cleopatra also is said to have committed suicide, along with some of her attendants. There's many different accounts about how she killed herself. Some say that she used a viper, an asp snake. Its venom, she allowed the snake to bite her, and then she died. Others say that she may have injected herself with a poison. There were needles and things like that in this point in history, and we know that people in Greco-Roman times knew how to use poisons. We don't know for sure because we have not found the bodies of Antony and Cleopatra. The tomb location is unknown, where they were actually buried. Their final resting place is unknown, but archaeologists debate its location, and there's many sites that they're investigating, which we'll talk about in a moment. Experts believe that the tomb of Cleopatra and Antony was probably in Taposiris Magna, outside of Alexandria. This is, by the way, a necropolis or city of the dead in Greek. There's many individuals buried in this site. Most of their remains are mummified in the Egyptian custom that was adopted by the Greeks that moved to Egypt. This is a bust of Cleopatra found near the site, and this is a bust of Mark Antony as well. Remember, the Greeks that took control of Egypt often portrayed themselves in the Egyptian style to get the support of the Egyptian people. So now we'll look at the tomb and some of the human remains at the tomb. First, we'll look at the tomb itself. It's a series of shafts and graves underground. There are burials that date from the time of the death of Cleopatra in about 30 BCE. There's mummified remains of multiple individuals at the site. The remains have been heavily damaged by flooding. This site is on the coast. Coastlines change with time. Inscriptions of Antony and Cleopatra have been found nearby. So some people think that they were probably buried in this necropolis, although identifying their remains from the others would be very difficult. But this site is still important because it shows that the Greeks were interested in practicing mummification in Egyptian burial rite. The Greeks really didn't like the preservation of bodies in their own civilization. They thought that that was not an appropriate thing to do. But when they took over Egypt, they began to adopt this Egyptian tradition of preservation of the dead. And actually, later Romans will also practice mummification as well once they have control of Egypt. So now we'll look at some of the mummies that are left behind. Here are some of the mummified remains and other interesting remains found at Taposiris Magna. You can see the mummified remains are not in very good shape. There's been water damage. It's really mostly just skeletal remains at this point, as you can see. What's interesting is some of the remains in the site have golden tongues. It's believed that these golden prosthetic tongues were placed inside the deceased after they had died post-mortem, so that they could talk with the dead. Here we see the death mask from an anthropoid. Anthropoid means human-shaped coffin. This is made in more the Greek style rather than the Egyptian style. The style is a little bit different than those used by the Egyptians earlier on. And here we see multiple mummified individuals placed together. It's possible these are a family. It's also possible that multiple generations were buried in these tombs, and sometimes even slaves and servants would be buried with the family, post-mortem, of course. Here again is the extent of the Roman Empire at its greatest point. Egypt was added to the Roman Empire after the death of Cleopatra between like 30 and 27 BCE. We also see Gaul here, brought in by Julius Caesar. Greece, Anatolia, brought in stages, and of course North Africa and Hispania. And then Britannia is going to be brought in under Emperor Claudius, which we'll talk about in a future video. So in 30 BCE, Octavian is elected consul with his general, Marcus Agrippa. 3 years later, by 27 BCE, the Senate declares Octavian Augustus Princeps, meaning the illustrious one, or the first citizen. The Romans will refer to their emperor as the first citizen. Even though Augustus was an autocrat, a king in all but name, he knew he couldn't claim to be a king. He couldn't wear a crown. He couldn't refer to himself as a monarch. The Romans, especially Romans of the upper class, would not have tolerated that. So he refers to himself as the first citizen. And instead of dressing himself as a king, he dresses as a general. We see that he's wearing a toga, a symbol of Roman culture, but he's also wearing a Roman-style breastplate. And the upper class came to support Octavian as emperor, or Augustus Caesar, as he came to be called, because he promised stability for Rome. And he also promised that he would not be a king. And even though he would have, legally speaking, all of the power, he would not just trample over the Senate. And he would do good things for the Roman people. So everyday people liked Augustus Caesar because he was related to Julius Caesar. He was a successful general. And the elite eventually came to support Augustus Caesar because he promised them stability, and he promised that he would not be a tyrant. He promised he would be the first citizen. He would be the chief patron of the Roman people, and everyone would be his client, but he would be a good patron. And so with the ascension of Octavian to Augustus Caesar, his becoming emperor, the Roman Republic comes to an end. And this is a life-size marble statue of Augustus Caesar that's actually in the Vatican, and a coin bearing the profile of Augustus Caesar. Here is the division of the Roman Empire about the year 14 CE. So during Augustus Caesar's reign, the red regions are ruled by the emperor via lifetime delegates called pro-praetorian legates. These would be appointed by the emperor to rule for life in these provinces shown here in red. Blue regions are going to be ruled by the Senate via annual proconsuls or governors that they appointed. So the Senate does have some control over some of the Roman provinces in the imperial system. The emperor, though, has the most power by far. And Italia, shown in yellow, is going to be ruled directly by the Senate. But the Senate in this system must defer to the emperor if the emperor and the Senate have a disagreement. Final thing we'll talk about in this video is this statue of Augustus Caesar and its painted replicas. The Romans generally painted their statues in a variety of colors. Here we see Augustus Caesar painted. It's said that he had fairly light skin and that he had reddish blonde hair, as these statues show. He wears purplish red, the color of the Julius Caesar, a color of royalty, but also just a color of wealth. Remember, Augustus Caesar did not want to seem too much like a king, so he portrays himself in armor and a toga rather than like a crown. The armor, of course, highlights his military successes. His breastplate features a series of reliefs showing stories from Roman history and stories of the gods to show that he has not just ruled because of his military power, but because of divine power. Interestingly enough, there's also sphinxes, symbols of Egypt, on his breastplate as well. Those are supposed to symbolize his defeat of Cleopatra and his takeover of Egypt. Conclusion. Roman militarism strengthened and enlarged the Roman Republic, as seen during events like the Punic Wars and the capture of Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Gaul, etc. The Marian reforms instituted by Consul Marius were meant to strengthen the Roman military and professionalize soldiering in the Roman Republic, but it also made Roman legionaries more loyal to their generals than to the Senate and the Republic. Other issues like breakdown of systems of patron-client obligations also are going to be a problem in the late Roman Republic. So increased militarism, the Marian reforms making soldiers more loyal to their generals and their legions than to Rome itself, combined with breakdowns in obligation systems, as seen by the failure of the Gracchi reforms, for example, the Catiline conspiracy. Romans were increasingly turning to violence to solve their problems and to take and consolidate power, rather than using peaceful civil means. And this turn to violence will threaten the stability of the Republic. It will lead to civil wars, the dictatorship of Sulla and then Julius Caesar, and ultimately the rise of Emperor Caesar Augustus, who will dissolve the Republic and become emperor. And as emperor, he will claim to be a patron of the Roman people, the first citizen. But really, he and other emperors are kings in all but name. The Roman government and the Senate have to defer to him, and of course the people must obey the emperor. And we'll talk about the Roman Empire in coming videos.